I never thought I'd end up living in Mrs. Eleanor Hartwick's house, but when you're 23, fresh out of college with a mountain of student debt and a barely there salary from your first real job, you take what you can get. The ad on Craigslist was simple: room for rent, quiet household, prefer responsible young person, reasonable rate. The address was in one of those older neighborhoods where the houses still had wraparound porches and the trees formed tunnels over the streets. When I knocked on the door that first time, I half expected no one to answer. The house looked like something out of a storybook, with its powder blue paint peeling just slightly at the corners and a garden that was immaculately maintained despite the late autumn chill. But the door opened almost immediately, and there she was. Mrs. Hartwick was exactly what you'd picture when you think of a sweet old lady. She was small, maybe 5'2", with white hair pulled back in a neat bun, and eyes that were still sharp and bright despite her age. She wore a cardigan that looked hand-knitted and smelled faintly of lavender and vanilla. When she smiled at me, I felt immediately at ease. "You must be here about the room," she said, her voice warm but firm. "Come in, dear. Let's have some tea and talk." The inside of the house was like stepping back in time. The furniture was old but well cared for, with doilies on the armrests and photographs covering nearly every surface. The walls were papered with patterns that hadn't been in style since the 70s. But somehow it all worked together. It felt like a home, something I hadn't experienced in the cramped apartment I'd been sharing with 3 other people. We sat in her living room, and she poured tea from a delicate china set that probably cost more than my car. She asked me about myself, where I worked, what I did, whether I was a quiet person. I told her I was an editor at a small publishing house, that I mostly kept to myself, that I'd be a good tenant. She studied me for a long moment, those sharp eyes seeming to look right through me. "I think you'll do nicely," she finally said. "The room is upstairs, second door on the left. I don't have many rules, but the ones I have are important. No guests after 9 p.m., no loud music, and absolutely no one goes into my study. That room stays locked, always. Can you agree to that?" I nodded. The rent she quoted was less than half what I'd been paying. I would have agreed to almost anything. I moved in the following weekend. My room was cozy, with a window that overlooked the garden and enough space for my bed, desk, and the few boxes of belongings I owned. Mrs. Hartwick helped me carry things up the stairs despite my protests, insisting that she was stronger than she looked. Life in that house fell into a comfortable rhythm quickly. Mrs. Hartwick was an early riser, and I'd often come downstairs to find breakfast already made. Scrambled eggs, toast, fresh fruit. She never asked me to pay for food, waving away my offers with a smile. We'd eat together sometimes, and she'd tell me stories about the neighborhood, about how things used to be. She'd lived in that house for over 50 years, she told me. She'd moved in with her husband right after they got married. He had passed away 15 years ago, and she'd been alone ever since. They'd never had children, which she said with a sadness that made my chest ache. I got the sense that she was lonely, that having me there filled some void in her life. I tried to be a good tenant and, I suppose, a good companion. I'd help her with things around the house, changing light bulbs, reaching high shelves, carrying groceries. On weekends, we'd sometimes sit in the living room together, her knitting while I read. It was peaceful in a way I hadn't expected. Months passed. Winter gave way to spring, and Mrs. Hartwick's garden exploded with color. She spent hours out there tending to her roses and tulips with a devotion that was almost religious. I'd watch her sometimes from my window, this tiny woman with dirt on her hands and a smile on her face, and feel grateful that I'd found this place. But there was always that locked door, the study. It was at the end of the hallway on the first floor, and in all the time I lived there, I never saw it open. Sometimes, late at night, I'd hear Mrs. Hartwick in there. The sound of papers rustling, drawers opening and closing, her footsteps crossing the floor. Once, I could have sworn I heard her crying, soft and broken, but when I went downstairs to check on her, she was in the kitchen, making tea, perfectly composed. I never asked about the study. It wasn't my business, and Mrs. Hartwick had been so kind to me that I didn't want to pry. But I'd be lying if I said I wasn't curious. It was a Tuesday morning in late June when everything changed. I came downstairs for breakfast and found the kitchen empty. No coffee brewing, no eggs on the stove, no Mrs. Hartwick humming softly to herself as she moved around the room. The silence felt wrong, heavy in a way that made my stomach twist. "Mrs. Hartwick," I called out, moving through the first floor. Nothing. Her bedroom door was closed, which was unusual. She was always up before me. I knocked softly. "Mrs. Hartwick, are you all right?" Still nothing. A cold dread settled over me as I turned the handle and pushed the door open. She was lying in bed, peaceful, her hands folded over her chest. For a moment I thought she was just sleeping. But then I saw how still she was, how waxy her skin looked in the morning light streaming through the curtains. I knew before I even crossed the room to check her pulse. Mrs. Eleanor Hartwick was gone. The next few days were a blur. I called 911, and then the paramedics came, and then the police, because that's protocol when someone dies at home. They were kind but efficient, asking me questions I barely remember answering. Yes, she was elderly. No, she hadn't been ill, at least not that I knew of. Yes, I was just a tenant. No, I didn't know about any family. That last part turned out to be true. Mrs. Hartwick had no living relatives. Her lawyer showed up the day after she died, a thin man in his 60s named Mr. Pemberton, who looked like he'd stepped out of a Dickens novel. He explained that Mrs. Hartwick had been her client for over 30 years, that she kept her affairs in meticulous order. "She left instructions," he said, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. "Very specific instructions. The house is to be sold, with the proceeds going to various charities, but there are some personal effects she wanted distributed first. You're mentioned, actually." I was stunned. Me? But I only knew her for 8 months. Mr. Pemberton gave me a small, sad smile. "Mrs. Hartwick was very particular about her wishes. She updated her will just 2 months ago. She left you several items and—" he paused, pulling an envelope from his briefcase. "And this letter. She was quite insistent that you receive it immediately upon her passing." The envelope was cream-colored, expensive paper, with my name written across the front in Mrs. Hartwick's elegant cursive. My hands shook as I took it from him. "There's also the matter of the study," Mr. Pemberton continued. "She requested that you be the one to go through it. She said you'd understand what to do with what you found there. But I've never been in the study. She always kept it locked." "I know," she told me. He reached into his pocket and pulled out an old brass key. "She wanted you to have this. Take your time with the room and the letter. I'll be handling the estate sale, but that won't begin for another 2 weeks. You're welcome to stay until then. Free of charge, of course." After he left, I sat in the living room for a long time, the envelope in my hands. The house felt different now. Emptier in a way that had nothing to do with Mrs. Hartwick's absence. It felt like it was holding its breath, waiting. Finally, I opened the envelope. The letter inside was several pages long, written in that same careful handwriting. My vision blurred as I began to read. "My dear, if you're reading this, then I've passed on, and I hope it was peaceful. I hope I didn't suffer, and I hope I didn't frighten you too badly with my departure. Death comes for us all, and I've been ready for quite some time. I know you must be confused about why I've left you anything at all. We've only known each other a short while,
and you might think it's strange for an old woman to take such an interest in a young person she barely knows. But you see, I know you better than you think. Or rather, I knew someone very much like you. I need to tell you a story. It's not a happy one, but it's important, and I've carried it alone for too long. You deserve to know it. Everyone deserves to know it, but somehow it's become your burden to bear along with mine. 53 years ago, I had a daughter. Her name was Charlotte, and she was the light of my life. She had your eyes, did you know that? That same deep brown with flecks of gold when the sun hit them just right. She had your smile, too, and your way of tilting your head when you were thinking about something serious. Charlotte was 22 when she disappeared. 22. So young, with her whole life ahead of her. It was 1972, and she'd just graduated from college. She wanted to be a writer, just like you work with writers. She'd moved into the city, gotten a small apartment, was working at a bookstore while she wrote her novel. She called me every Sunday, without fail. We'd talk for hours about everything and nothing.
And then one Sunday, she didn't call. I waited all day, all night. By Monday morning, I was frantic. I drove to her apartment, and the landlord let me in. Everything was there. Her clothes, her typewriter, the manuscript she'd been working on. But Charlotte was gone. The police investigated, of course, but this was the 70s, and young women disappeared sometimes. That's what they told me. Young women ran away to find themselves, to escape family obligations. They suggested that Charlotte had left voluntarily, that she'd call when she was ready. They stopped looking after 6 months, but I never stopped. I spent years searching for her. Every lead, every possible sighting, every unidentified body found anywhere in the state. My husband, God rest his soul, he eventually had to let go. The grief was killing him, destroying us. But I couldn't. I wouldn't. Charlotte was my baby, and I needed to know what happened to her. I had to stop reading. My hands were shaking so hard the paper rattled. There were tears on my cheeks that I didn't remember crying. I looked around the living room at all those photographs covering every surface, and for the first time, I really looked at them. There, among the photos of Mrs. Hartwick and her husband, were pictures of a young woman. She was everywhere once I started looking, graduating from high school in cap and gown, blowing out birthday candles, standing in front of a Christmas tree. And she did have my eyes. My smile. The resemblance was unsettling, like looking at a relative I'd never known I had. I picked up the letter again, my heart pounding. I searched for 47 years. 47 years of dead ends and false hopes, and nights spent crying until I had nothing left. And then, 3 years ago, I finally found the truth. There was a man named Richard Kemper. Not the famous serial killer, but someone just as monstrous in his own way. He was a janitor at the building where Charlotte worked, quiet, unassuming, the kind of man people never really noticed. He'd been watching her for months, the police would later discover, following her, learning her patterns. He took her as she was walking home from the bookstore one night. He kept her alive for 3 days before he killed her. I won't tell you the details. I can't. And you don't need that horror in your mind. But what you need to know is that he buried her in the woods about 90 miles from here, in a place so remote that her body might never have been found if Kemper hadn't confessed. He was arrested in 2022 for another crime, assault, that finally put him in the system. DNA evidence linked him to several cold cases from the 70s and 80s. Charlotte was one of them. The detective called me on a Thursday afternoon. I was 78 years old, and I finally knew what had happened to my daughter. They found her remains 6 months later. I buried her next to her father. After all those years of not knowing, of imagining every possible horror, I finally had some closure. But it didn't feel the way I thought it would. There was no relief, no peace, just a terrible, empty finality. I'm telling you this because I need you to understand why I did what I did. Why I chose you specifically when you answered my advertisement. When I saw your picture in your email inquiry about the room, I nearly fainted. The resemblance was so striking that for a moment I thought I was losing my mind. I thought maybe grief had finally broken something in my brain. But then I met you in person, and I knew. I didn't rent you the room because I needed the money. I don't. This house is paid off, and I have more than enough to live on. I rented you the room because I needed to be near someone who reminded me of my daughter. I needed to hear young footsteps in this house again, to make breakfast for someone, to not be so completely alone with my grief. I know that sounds selfish. It was selfish. I used you, in a way, to fill a void that could never really be filled. But I want you to know that my affection for you was real. These past 8 months have been a gift. Watching you come and go, hearing you laugh on the phone with your friends, seeing you grow into your job and your life, it gave me back a piece of something I thought I'd lost forever. I hope I was kind to you. I tried to be. I hope I made you feel at home and safe and cared for, because you deserved that, and because it's what I would have done for Charlotte if I'd been given the chance. Now, about the study. That room has been locked for 15 years, since my husband died. It's where I kept everything related to Charlotte's case. Every police report, every newspaper clipping, every note I ever wrote to myself about a possible lead. It's also where I kept her things, her manuscript, her clothes, her journals. It became a shrine, I suppose, and after a while, I couldn't bear to go in there anymore. The weight of it all was too much.
But 2 months ago, when I knew my time was getting short, you can feel it, when death is coming. I went back in. I organized everything. I wrote detailed notes about what everything was, where it came from, why it mattered. And I decided that someone needed to know Charlotte's story. Really know it. Not just the tragic headline, but who she was as a person. I chose you for this task because you understand stories. You work with them every day. You shape them and give them meaning. And because you have a kind heart. I've seen it in how you treat people, how you move through the world. I trust you to handle Charlotte's story with the care it deserves. In the study, you'll find boxes, labeled and organized. I want you to read everything. I want you to know my daughter. And then, I want you to decide what to do with her story. Maybe you'll write it, or maybe you'll find someone who can. Maybe you'll create something that ensures Charlotte isn't just another cold case statistic, another name on a list of victims. Maybe you'll give her the voice she never got to have. Her manuscript is in there too. It's rough, unfinished, but it's beautiful. She was so talented. Maybe you can see that it gets published, if you think it's worth it. Maybe you can finish it for her, though I know that's a heavy thing to ask. I'm also leaving you some money, enough to take time off work if you need it, enough to make this project possible if you choose to undertake it, and if you choose not to, I'll understand. This is a burden I have no right to place on you, but I had to ask. I had to try to give Charlotte this one last chance to matter, to be remembered. There's one more thing in the study. A box labeled, "For You." It contains some things I want you to have, personal items that I think you'll appreciate. Consider them a thank you
for bringing life back into this sad old house, even if you didn't know that's what you were doing. I hope I didn't frighten you with all of this. I hope you can forgive an old woman for her strange request, and I hope, wherever you go from here, that you have a beautiful life. You deserve every happiness, every success, every moment of joy that this world can offer. Thank you for the time we had together. Thank you for the conversations and the quiet companionship, and for making me feel less alone. You'll never know what a gift that was. With all my love and gratitude, Eleanor Hartwick. I sat there for I don't know how long after finishing the letter, tears streaming down my face. The house creaked around me, settling into itself the way old houses do. Outside, Mrs. Hartwick's garden bloomed, indifferent to the grief contained within these walls. Finally, I stood up. The brass key felt heavy in my pocket as I walked down the hallway toward the study. I'd passed this door hundreds of times, never giving it much thought beyond mild curiosity. Now it felt momentous, like opening it would change something fundamental about my life. The key turned smoothly in the lock, as if the mechanism had been recently oiled. The door swung open with barely a sound. The study was smaller than I had imagined, but every inch of it was purposeful. The walls were lined with filing cabinets and bookshelves. A large desk sat beneath the window, its surface covered with neatly stacked boxes, each one labeled in Mrs. Hartwick's precise handwriting. The late afternoon sun streamed through the curtains, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air. I stepped inside, and the door clicked shut behind me. The room smelled like old paper and lavender, just like Mrs. Hartwick herself. I approached the desk slowly, reading the labels on the boxes. Police reports, 1972 to 1975. Newspaper clippings. Private investigator files. Charlotte's Journal, high school. Charlotte's Journal, college. And there, set apart from the others, a box simply labeled, "For you." I opened that one first. Inside was a handwritten note on top. "These belong to Charlotte. I think she would have wanted you to have them." Beneath the note was a beautiful vintage typewriter, the keys worn smooth from use. There were several leather-bound journals, their pages filled with flowing handwriting, a silver bracelet with a small charm in the shape of a pen, and a framed photograph of Charlotte, smiling at the camera with that familiar tilt of her head, her eyes bright with life and possibility. I picked up the photograph, and something inside me broke open. This was a real person, not just a tragedy, not just a cold case file, but a woman who had dreams and hopes, and a mother who loved her more than anything. A woman who was stolen from the world before she could make her mark on it. I set the photograph down carefully and reached for the box labeled Charlotte's Manuscript. Inside was a thick stack of typed pages, some with handwritten notes in the margins. The title page read, "The Space Between Stars," by Charlotte Hartwick. I began to read. Mrs. Hartwick had been right. It was rough and unfinished, but it was also achingly beautiful. It was a story about a young woman trying to find her place in the world, struggling with the expectations of others while trying to honor her own dreams. It was raw and honest and full of the kind of insight that only comes from really paying attention to life. I read for hours until the sun set and the room grew dark. I turned on the desk lamp and kept reading. The manuscript ended abruptly mid-sentence, frozen at the moment when Charlotte's life was interrupted. The unfinished thought felt like a wound that would never heal. When I finally set the pages down, I knew what I had to do. Mrs. Hartwick had asked me to decide what to do with Charlotte's story, and the answer was suddenly, painfully clear. This story needed to be told. Not just the tragedy of what happened to her, but the fullness of who she was. The world needed to know about Charlotte Hartwick, her talent, her dreams, her beautiful, unfinished life. Over the next 2 weeks, I barely left the house. I read everything in that study. I read Charlotte's journals and saw her evolve from a dreamy high school girl into a thoughtful young woman with opinions about everything from politics to poetry. I read the police reports and felt rage at how quickly they'd dismissed her disappearance. I read Mrs. Hartwick's notes, decades of desperate searching, and my heart broke for her over and over again. I also started writing. I couldn't help it. The story demanded to be told, and I was the only one left to tell it. I used Charlotte's typewriter, my fingers finding the same keys hers once had, and I began to piece together a narrative that honored both Charlotte and her mother. Mr. Pemberton came by one afternoon to check on me. He seemed surprised to find me surrounded by papers and files, my laptop open alongside Charlotte's old typewriter. "I'm going to write about her," I told him. "About Charlotte and Mrs. Hartwick. I'm going to make sure people know their story." He nodded slowly, a sad smile on his face. "Eleanor would have been glad. She talked about you quite a bit in those last few months. She said you had a good heart and a way with words. I think she knew you'd say yes to this." "Did you know Charlotte?" "I did. I was just starting my practice when she disappeared. I handled some of the legal aspects of the search efforts. I watched Eleanor nearly destroy herself looking for answers. When they finally found Charlotte's remains, I thought maybe Eleanor would have some peace. But I think the only peace she ever found was in those months with you." After he left, I went back to the garden. Mrs. Hartwick's roses were in full bloom, their scent heavy in the summer air. I thought about how she'd tended them so carefully, how she'd found beauty even in her grief, how she'd opened her home to a stranger who reminded her of everything she'd lost just to feel a little less alone. I thought about Charlotte, 22 years old, full of talent and promise, her life cut short by a monster's selfish cruelty. I thought about all the things she never got to do, the books she never got to write, the life she never got to live. And I thought about Mrs. Hartwick's request, her hope that Charlotte could still have a voice, that her story could still matter. That night, I called my editor at the publishing house. I told her I needed to take a leave of absence, that I had a project I needed to work on. She was surprised. I'd never asked for time off before, but she agreed. I spent the next 6 months in that house, even after the estate sale, even after Mr. Pemberton offered to let me out of my obligation. I couldn't leave. Not yet. I worked on 2 manuscripts simultaneously. Charlotte's manuscript, which I carefully edited and prepared for publication, and my own book about Charlotte and Eleanor's story. Charlotte's manuscript, The Space Between Stars, was published first. I wrote an introduction explaining who she was and what had happened to her. I included one of her photographs. The book found a small but devoted readership, and reviewers praised the raw honesty of her voice. "A haunting glimpse at a talent we lost too soon," one review said. Charlotte finally got to be a published author. My book about their story took longer. I wanted to get it right, to honor both of them properly. I called it Searching, A Mother's Love and a Daughter's Dream. It was part true crime, part memoir,
part meditation on grief and loss, and the ways we keep searching for the people we love, even after they're gone.
The book did well, better than I'd expected. People were moved by Eleanor's decades-long search, by her refusal to give up on her daughter. They were heartbroken by Charlotte's story and angry at how easily she'd been dismissed. The book sparked conversations about cold cases and the women who disappear and are forgotten. I did interviews and readings, and I always made sure to show Charlotte's photograph, to say her name, to remind people that she was a real person with real dreams. Mrs. Hartwick's wish had come true. Charlotte mattered. She was remembered. The house was eventually sold to a young family with 2 small children. Before I moved out, I took one last walk through the rooms. I stood in the study, now empty of its files and boxes, and whispered a thank you to Mrs. Hartwick. I picked a rose from the garden to press in my copy of Charlotte's book. I keep the typewriter on my desk in my new apartment. I wear Charlotte's bracelet sometimes when I write. The photograph of her sits on my bookshelf, and occasionally I'll catch sight of it and feel that strange sense of connection, of responsibility. I think about Mrs. Hartwick often, about her kindness and her grief and her hope that a stranger might give her daughter back to the world. I think about how she must have felt, seeing someone who reminded her so much of Charlotte, and how brave she was to let me into her life, knowing it would hurt. I never did figure out if it was fate or coincidence that led me to that house, to that ad on Craigslist, to those 8 months with Mrs. Hartwick. Maybe it doesn't matter. What matters is that I found a letter with my name on it, and inside was a trust I couldn't refuse and a story that needed to be told. Charlotte Hartwick was 22 years old when she died. She wanted to be a writer. She loved poetry and coffee shops and long walks in the city. She had her mother's determination and her father's gentle humor. She was someone's daughter, someone's friend, someone's loss. And now, because of a kind old lady who rented a room to a stranger, because of a letter and a locked study and a manuscript frozen in time, Charlotte's voice still echoes. Her words still matter. Her story is still being told. I think Mrs. Hartwick would be pleased with that. I hope wherever she is, she's with Charlotte again. And they're both finally at peace.